Good evening, everyone. Welcome to IMPRI Web Policy Talk. I request Dr. Chattopadhyay to proceed with the deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika, and very good evening from Shantiniketan. I am Dr. Shoumodip Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor, Vishwabharati University, and a Senior Fellow at this Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. On behalf of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, I welcome you all to this 15th edition of City Conversation Series. India is urbanizing and the growth is occurring across the urban spectrum. And following India's attempt to globalization and liberalization since 1990s, cities are recognized as key to stimulating economic growth. And to achieve a world-class urban system, urban development policies from 1919 onwards started to embrace the philosophy of new public management and put emphasis on decentralization and increased private sector involvement in urban policymaking. And Indian cities have distinctively experienced simultaneous sort of rollback of neoliberal state in areas such as urban basic services and rollout of the same state in others, for example, land acquisition for creation of special economic zones, slum evictions, facilitation of private sector participation, emphasis on financial discipline, market-based finance for citizens, so on. And emphasis is also placed on to pursue large urban development projects for transforming Indian cities into world-class cities. And and correspondingly, the task of policymaking governance are now increasingly being negotiated by institutional forms. For example, the special purpose vehicles, the parastatal bodies, the quasi-autonomous government organizations, and several non-state actors, especially the business leaders, elite and middle-class organizations, and civic activists. Now, this results in subordination of democratically elected local bodies to these newly autonomous institutions. Now, all these have significant repercussions on the urban poor people's life and livelihoods, creating a kind of new forms of marginalization. They face exclusion from state provided access to the basic facilities and services in the city. And also, they do not find space in the participatory processes that are laid down as an integral part of a good urban governance. Now, these effects of COVID-19 have been particularly severe on India's migrants workers who are economically vulnerable and socially marginalized, who are absorbed into highly informal, invisible, and exploitative working arrangements. Now, one thing is clear from the severity of impacts of COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown on the migrant worker is that this group needs special attention. And COVID-19 exposed not just the plight of the migrant workers, but also highlighted how important their contributions are for our economy as a whole. And by making visible their plight, this pandemic has presented a unique opportunity to rethink about the potential pathways through which their lives and livelihoods in the cities can be improved. And the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, along with Industra Global and City Makers Mission International, actually has been conducting this series on city conversation. And in this talk series, we are engaging with experts on urban and regional studies to understand the specific challenges of urbanization and also what are the possible pathways to make the cities more sustainable, more inclusive. And today, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Asima Sood, Associate Professor at Anant National University. In this university, she teaches urban policy, research methods, and academic writing. And she is the international corresponding editor at Urban Studies and also has been associated as editor and editorial advisory group member with the Economic and Political Weekly's Review of Urban Affairs since its founding. And she coordinated the urban transformation curriculum for EPG Pathshala, an initiative of the Indian Ministry of Education to create postgraduate curricula across the discipline. And she also contributed the section on Indian urbanization to the Oxford Bibliographies of Urban Studies. And her research lies at the intersection of institutional economics and urban and development studies. And it combines qualitative and quantitative methodologies to examine the privatized forms of urban governance and informal public spaces in India. In fact, a co-edited volume titled India's Greenfield Urban Future, the Politics of Land, Planning and Infrastructure is forthcoming at Orient Black Swan, and she is also working on a monograph titled Capital Citizens, analyzing the models of private local governments on the Indian growth hubs. And she has been the recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including the fellowships from Urban Studies Foundation, the India Foundation of the Arts, the Azim Prem University Foundation, the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, and the Center de Sciences Humanis. And her research has been published in almost all the leading journals on urban policies and theories. For example, Urban Studies, Cities, Territory Politics and Governance, Information, Communication and Society, Journal of Institutional Economics, Economic and Political Weekly. Apart from the Wiley Blackwell Encyclopedia of Urban and Regional Research, World Science Report 2013, among others. And she earned her PhD in economics from Cornell University. And today, the title of her talk is, Can the Migrant Be Heard of by Our Cities? Migration, Exclusion, Urbanization, and Precarity. And in today's talk, Dr. Sood plans to look at the migration crisis through the lens of the role played by the governance institution, especially in the peri-urban and peri-metropolitan location, the lens that is crucially important but remains largely unexplored. And also, today we are honored to have among us Professor R.B. Bhagat, Head, Department of Migration and Urban Studies from IIPS Mumbai. And we are also expect to be joined by Professor Gopa Samanta of University of Burdwan in a short while. So before that, let me now just again, on behalf of the team MP, I welcome you all. I welcome especially Dr. Ashima Sood and Professor R.B. Bhagat. And it's over to you, Dr. Sood, for your presentation.
Ma'am, you'll have to unmute.
Thank you so much, Professor Chattopadhyay, for that warm introduction. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Kumar also for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm so glad to be able to talk today with Professor Bhagat, who is surely the doyen of migration demography in India. Professor Gopa Samanta's work has been such a critical reference point for the work that I'm going to be presenting today, though I think I won't be able to discuss it in as much detail as I would like. So the question that I'm addressing today is, can the migrant be heard by our cities? Migration, exclusionary urbanization, and precarity. Let me first start by actually giving you an overview of what I plan to tell you about. Let me first just give you a little bit of an overview and then I can get started. So when we think about the COVID lockdown of 2020, it brought to our TV screens, to our newspapers, to our social media, these extremely disturbing images of the migrant workers of India fleeing India's metropolises to return to their rural origins. While commentators have sought to explain this reverse migration in terms of the precarious urban living and working conditions of these migrants, sometimes they've also pointed to this atavistic kind of attachment to a rural life. There are actually very few analysts who focused on the role that is played by governance institutions. Today, what I want to do is I want to present some recent research where I've been trying to make the connection between the peri-urban and peri-metropolitan location of these new economic activities and especially construction activities, and the often unrepresentative nature of local government in these sites. When you think of places like Greater Hyderabad, or you think of places like Noida, what comes to mind are these very fragmented and specialized forms of government. And these make it extremely hard for migrant workers to assert their right to the city. So when we think about these recent scenes of reverse migration, they may represent the outcome of very long-standing processes of exclusionary urbanization. Not only have the urban poor been pushed out of the core of our megacities, the political economy of peri-urban settings in many cases is making it very difficult for older models of vote bank politics, for example, that make it possible for the poor to assert a right to the city. The presentation is partially based on a working paper. The paper is called Speculative Frontier, Real Estate Governance and Occupancy on the Metropolitan Periphery. And the research on which it was based comes from a grant from the Azim Premji University Foundation. So let me start by just foregrounding this crisis that we are witnessing and have witnessed in the last few months. By some estimates, more than 7.5 million migrants had gone back to their place of origin by mid-May 2020, and this was nearly 2 months after the lockdown. Other estimates suggested that the numbers were an order of magnitude higher. And of course, journalists, as we have seen, have really followed these brutal journeys, sometimes on buses, sometimes on trains, and sometimes on foot in the scalding April May heat of North India. What I want to do today is to position these very stark scenes of departure against what urban scholars know about long standing patterns of urbanization and urban governance in India. And also perhaps contribute to our understanding of what is happening in the peri-urban locations where a lot of these construction workers and migrant workers have found employment. But let me get started and actually think first about the proximate causes why so many of India's urban workforce have chosen to leave rather than stay, even in the middle of this raging pandemic. So, the most immediate crisis which has driven this exodus is that of joblessness. Factories, construction sites, offices have closed in response to the central government's lockdown measures. Workers were left stranded without money for food or rent. Some social commentators have also argued that the city may be the source of economic security, but it is the village that provides social refuge in times of extreme insecurity. I think what's undeniable, however, is the COVID crisis has written large in unmistakable terms the very precarious right to the city for the most vulnerable groups that construct our cities and keep them humming with activity. Now, academics and activists have correctly raised issues of housing injustice that have prevented India's informal workers from accessing secure and high quality housing. Equally, it is by now established by the work of scholars such as Amitabh Kundu, Chan Raman, and others that urban growth in India has been very highly exclusionary. So, if we think about the last census period for which we have data, which is 2011 to 2001 to 2011, there was not only lower in migration but also net out migration from some of India's biggest mega cities, such as Mumbai. I think the question then really arises, which is why are our cities so hostile to migrants? But what I'm trying to argue here today is that this question cannot be separated from the larger question of how our cities either accommodate or rather fail to accommodate poor groups, informal workers, and informal settlements. Um, the rates of what Ravi Srivastav has called permanent migrants are actually a very small part of urban growth in India. Over the last several decades, these kinds of flows have added not more than a quarter or something like that at their peak to urban growth. So, to understand exclusionary urbanization and this problematic, I want to take us back to an episode in 2017 that received a lot of news coverage but has been since perhaps forgotten. So, I would please request you to change the slide here. Um, this incident at Mahagun Modern, which is a gated community in Noida, may encapsulate in brief answers to what makes Indian cities such inhospitable terrain for poor groups. So, what happened was this. Let me give you a brief reminder of the turn of events. In July 2017, a domestic worker went missing in Mahagun Modern. This is a middle class gated community in Sector 78 of Noida. The domestic worker's husband brought together a group and they went and actually stormed the gated community next day. The woman was found the next day from within the premises of the gated community. And after that, she and her employers, who were the Sethis, began to trade basically insults and claims about what had actually happened and who stole what. So the employers claimed that Zohra Bibi had actually stolen cash, and Zohra Bibi said that her wages had been taken away and not given to her by her employers. Now, the facts of this case were obviously very combustible. The employers were upper caste Hindus, and the maid was a Muslim migrant from West Bengal, and of course, coded as Bangladeshi. But I think to really understand the crux of what was happening here, we have to understand what happened afterwards. Several of the protesters that led the forced entry into Mahagun Modern were arrested by the police. And then the informal establishment that serviced Modern and the shanties which housed this domestic workers community were razed to the ground by the Noida authority. What we saw really was a kind of a display of class power, with the formal gated community winning the battle against its informal neighbors and service providers. There are many ways to read this, no doubt. The communal politics of our times definitely plays a role. So does the ascendance of these resident welfare associations, which have become very powerful. This is also a story about the poor social protections available to domestic workers. It is very much of a piece with the regimes of displacement and exclusionary urbanization that have emerged in post-millennial megacities. However, the Mahagun Modern episode also represents a moment of a breakdown of this contract. And the part of that breakdown is a story of urban governance. Let me explain to you what I mean here. I think to understand how this sort of really major point of breakdown came about, I find very useful to think about Partha Chatterjee's analysis of political society and civil society. So, till the 1980s, the urban contract allowed poor groups to be accommodated, sometimes even within the heart of mega cities, as populations, even if they were not full-fledged citizens. The government was forced to administer welfare for this political society because of competitive vote bank politics. The poor did not have patta, but they were given power, they were given water, they were given sanitation, they were given schools. And as Partha Chatterjee has argued, the rise of this paralegal kind of infrastructure to service the working classes was a really remarkable phenomenon of the 1970s and 80s. And the main point that Partha Chatterjee has made is that this welfareism, if we like, was fundamentally different from the rights and entitlements due to citizens. I would just request you here to please change the slide. And I have an image here from Bokaro, which is, of course, a steel town that was set up in the Nehruvian era. And, these are some bastis that have come up in this planned city. And, I think they make very well the point that I'm talking about, and which Partha Chatterjee is also talking about, which is that, there was a kind of welfareism and a willingness to accommodate the poor in the middle of even the planned city. Now, this diversity of tenure systems and this kind of claim making by the poorest groups continued right into the early 2000s, and they were very powerful at the level of the lower bureaucracy and municipal politics. And Solly Benjamin, of course, as you may know, has described this as occupancy politics. This occupancy politics made space for and forced the accommodation of all kinds of poor groups. Yet, as Partha Chatterjee noted, Leela Fernandez noted, and a number of other social scientists began to notice, things began to change in a very big way in the 1990s and even more so in the 2000s. Part of this change was this new prominence of middle class civil society and citizen groups. And they basically took on this mantle, this kind of crusade almost, of ridding the Indian megacities of the cattle, of the polluters, and of the encroachers. Partha Chatterjee located this sort of shift in this imagination of the changing imaginary of the Indian city. At the same time, the economic base of Indian cities was shifting from manufacturing to services. Factories were basically driven to the periphery. What resulted was that there was this widely shared vision of the post-industrial world-class city among middle-class citizens. And as Partha Chatterjee feared in the early 2000s, what has come to be is a city of extreme disparity and segregation. Now, Solly Benjamin, who is probably one of the pioneering and sort of most incisive commentators on the Indian urban scene, working with Bhuvneshwari Raman, he located sort of the enemy, if you like, of occupancy urbanism in Indian cities in master plan development. And according to him, the focus on planning was a very, very influential variable. And this analysis, I think, has come to be incorporated in a lot of subsequent studies, which have focused really on exclusionary forms of planning as the key culprit for the spatial disparities of the Indian city. Now, all this is fine, but where does the Mahagun modern episode fit into these narratives of the Indian city? First, I want to point out a large number of similarities, of course. Like much of Sector 78 Noida, Mahagun Modern is a master planned locality. It represents, in a way, a middle class city of dreams. And this is the terms that I'm using from MP Mahesh Sharma, who represents Noida. At the same time, Mahagun model also represents some points of difference from theorization of the politics of the poor in Chatterjee's or Benjamin's work. And this is where my own work starts. This is what my point of departure is. First, I want to point out that Noida is part of a new wave of real estate driven peri-urban growth that is shaping metropolitan peripheries. Second, and this is really remarkable, over 4 decades after its establishment, Noida still does not have a statutory urban government, no municipal corporation beyond the Noida Authority. So in some ways, it's a kind of a master plan census town. So let's take the implications of each of these differences in turn. First, Mahagun Modern is very typical of this new peri-urbanism that is emerging. There are two aspects to this peri-urbanism. First, it is overwhelmingly led by private real estate capital. And second, it is really concentrated in India's mega cities and million plus cities. And I would request you here to please change the slide because I have this map that comes from my project. How do we know this? So working with my co-PI, we looked at data from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy. And we looked at real estate projects with investments over 1 crore rupees. So these are really the largest, most prominent projects. And we mapped out their locations. The result is this map that you see. And the extent of geographic concentration is really, really outstanding. It's astounding. Now, out of all the completed real estate, housing, and commercial construction projects, 2/3 were located in, excuse me, one of India's top 8 tier 1 cities, right? Top 8 tier 1 cities, even though these cities, and these include, for example, the Delhi National Capital Region, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, Kolkata, Ahmedabad, Pune, these only comprise about a quarter, a little more than that of India's urban population. Out of this, nearly 15% of all completed, outstanding, and shelved real estate projects were located in the Delhi National Capital Region alone, which is where really Mahagun Modern and this, a phenomenon of peri-urban growth in Noida is located. So our database has about 7,500 or so projects, but these are really the largest and the most prominent projects anywhere in India. And their clustering around these Indian mega cities suggests what I like to call a kind of a speculative map of future urban India. These are sites not only of future population concentration, but also today, currently, they are also sites of large pools of construction labor, a large proportion of whom we know to be migrants. Now, if I may just request you to please change the slide. This is actually an image of Greater Hyderabad. And what you see here is the boundary of the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, which is in black. You see the outer ring road, which is the red dotted line. And these dots are essentially all of these real estate projects. Some of them are, of course, a large number are led by private Indian real estate developers. Some of them are led by the state government, some local government, But you see this remarkable clustering on the outskirts, especially on the western outskirts of the city. And this is an area that I've been looking at with a lot of interest. So, what are the kinds of governance arrangements in the settings of this real estate shaped peri-urban frontier? Um, and do they actually give voice to low skilled migrants and poor groups that are actually, as we have seen just now, are really clustered in these locations? This is one other place where the fate of the informal workers in Mahagun modern incident highlights the often overlooked dynamics of governance. And this is not merely about planning. Remember that middle class activists, in order to shape the city, they need institutional channels to realize this vision of the world class city. In places like Bangalore, as Michael Goldman and others have shown, this has happened through parastatals. It's happened through these, parallel channels, and elite groups. In other places, Delhi, Chennai, and many other parts of India, the resident welfare associations have eagerly co-opted into the state agendas. And of course, last but not least, is the changed role of the judiciary in enforcing exclusionary urbanization, whether it is in upholding evictions since the 2000s or in facilitating the spatial dislocation of industries from cities like Delhi. However, a key institutional channel that scholars have sometimes failed to note is the form of local government itself. Now, when we think about the 74th Constitutional Amendment, which really set up urban local bodies as the third tier of government in India, its key contribution was to create channels for underprivileged groups to attain representation. And Benjamin's occupancy urbanism really works through these local councillors who are socially embedded in communities. On the other hand, when we think of the Noida Authority or its counterparts like Bangalore's Electronic City Industrial Township, or if you think of the industrial area local authorities in Hyderabad, these are by design responsive only to industry and middle class groups. Now, this might seem simply an artifact of land use zoning, right? That these are essentially areas that are intended for industry. That's not the case. The fact is that Noida in 2011 had the population of over 6 lakhs. Similarly, in Hyderabad, these specialized and privatized enclaves like the industrial area local authorities often house middle class housing localities. At the same time, they devolved the powers and functions of the municipal government to the state's industrial infrastructure corporation. And this is these are entirely unrepresentative, unresponsive bodies. So the way that they function is ready to undermine the channels of vote bank politics and occupancy that poor groups have traditionally exercised in urban areas in order to assert, their claims to land and to services. Now, there's a second nuance to this story that I think, in all fairness, I should present, which is to note that the peri-urban is also a place where there is a lot of transitional and contested governments. So, for example, in peri-urban Hyderabad, there are many fast-growing villages and localities with a lot of real estate activity, and they have resisted inclusion into the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation. So, what is the result? The result is this very fragmented governance landscape, where at any given place, it's almost impossible to know who is in charge. Now, this kind of flux is not necessarily empowering to poor groups. We've looked at this in a recent paper, and where we studied a community that is situated at the spatial intersection of multiple governance regimes. And once again, I would request you to please present the next slide, which has this really remarkable image of peri-urban Hyderabad. And this community that I'm talking about, that we studied, and others like it on the peri-urban frontier, have always been vulnerable to eviction, even after many decades of occupation. They suffer real shortages in all kinds of basic services provision. They have severe water supply issues. And a big reason for this situation is that jurisdictional accountability is very hazy. So, as I come to the end of my presentation, let me summarize my argument. My argument is that the crisis of reverse migration that has become so starkly visible this year has been building up for decades. There has been exclusionary urbanization, but more important, it has also assumed new forms of exclusionary peri-urbanization. Ultimately, these exclusions have been made possible by the systematic dismantling of a paralegal welfare infrastructure of the 1970s and 1980s. Moreover, on the peripheries of cities, exclusionary peri-urbanization is upheld by new forms of specialized and transitional governance that are completely unresponsive to poor groups. And this is often in the areas that are seeing the largest real estate activity and construction workforces. Therefore, urban governance in this speculative map, if you like, of future India, really serves to undermine the possibility of citizenship for those that are actually constructing it. So, now in conclusion, I want to suggest that if we really want to look at this crisis of migration and reverse migration, we should look very closely at the democratic mechanisms at the local level. Do they give voice to migrant communities? Do we need reservations for migrant workers in ward sabhas? That's a mechanism that will only work in municipal bodies. How do we make development authorities, infrastructure corporations more responsive to these vulnerable workers? I think that is really the greatest governance challenge for our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shruth, for your very interesting presentation. So as always, it's really enthralling. So this is an like we have seen a lot of works on the migrants issue, but as you mentioned, there are very few studies which actually looked at this migrant crisis from this governance perspective, or using this governance frame, or the deficit of governance, which which actually characterizes the peri-urban areas. So that's very important. And what I think is that, as you rightly said, that because of this Indian cities experience with incomplete decentralization, there is a sort of insignificant devolution of funding and the public authority and the policy authority to the municipal level. But at the same time, city governments are being confronted with more interstate competition for attracting capital. For example, you talked about the speculative nature of the urbanism and all these things, but and what the state governments are doing, they are, for facilitating such world-class transformation of the Indian cities, they are actually creating several parastatal agencies, special purpose vehicles at different levels, and the statutory power of these agencies, they are actually going beyond the beyond making plans for city development, preparing detailed plans for plotting areas, for providing social and physical infrastructures and all these things. And the big advantage of these kind of entities are that these agencies are sit at a kind of arm's length to the state government for facilitating the necessary maneuvering and political legitimizing the state government's action. But the thing is that when all these institutions are there, that actually led to the kind of fragmented governance landscape, which you actually mentioned, that it led to the weakening of the elected local governments. Although the local governments are not there at the areas which you are actually looking at, the peri-urban areas and the peri-metropolitan areas, but as a whole, what is actually happening is that these poor people, they are finding it very difficult to raise their voices, to tell about their needs and priorities. So this is a very strange situation, and all these if I say the new state spaces which have been created, but these are all insulated and insulated from all the political maneuvering on which these poor people depend a lot. And this actually makes the entire decision-making process regarding all these facilities, urban services and all these, very much discretionary in nature. And participation, even if in some form are there, although more or less they are non-existent, but even if participation is there, but they are mannered in such a manner so as to legitimize the some kind of neoliberal vision of market-driven development. And here, more emphasis is placed on some particular notions of ordered cities, clean cities, efficient cities, and all, and so on and so forth. So, and also you mentioned about the politics of vote bank. So really, politics at the local level, they that actually plays a significant role in determining whether any particular area in the peri-urban regions, they are actually included in any urban development plans, in any plans or policies on or so. And urban poor who do not generally form a political constituency, they end up being completely unrepresented in such decision-making process. So actually, what we are seeing is that there is a gross underrepresentation of the migrant people, the urban poor people in the decision-making process, if any. You talked about the judicial activism. Recently, there are a lot of talks have been going on the judicial activism and all these things. But overall, so it is very much important, as you mentioned, that it is very much important for us to understand that how the Indian cities are going to be transformed through this kind of spatial imaginaries, the modes of control, the regulations, the governance, which are actually shaped by the intersection or interactions among these different multi-scalar actors with different sources of powers and politics. So it's really a very interesting presentation and all these things. But before that, before making any further comment, let me request Professor R.B. Bhagat if he can present his views or comments on the presentation made by Dr. Sood.
So, thank you.
Professor R.B. Bhagat is the head and professor of the urban and yes. So I think you do not need any introduction as far as the migration issues are concerned.
Yeah. For this group, I think I came several times. Do not need any introduction. So thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. And it is very nice listening Dr. Asima Sood. And she presented very articulately and very focused way what is happening in today's urbanization and particularly the peri-urban problems. So I think there is a absolutely very nice and presentation and the synthesis of what is happening at a metropolitan level. So metropolitan cities are dominating, and then peri-urbanization led by metropolitan cities. This is becoming very, very important. And then we have census towns, and then we can little bit go ahead. And that is also some sort of peri-urbanization or transitional or urbanization. So these are our continuous process or rural-urban continuum. But there are a lot of exclusion, I agree. And these are exclusions are basically economic exclusion and the way the capital accumulation took place and the profits, and then what happens, what is the role of the state, and then people are getting marginalized, and then obviously the migrants are the obvious categories of exclusion. So policies and program must focus it, but we don't have policies and program also focus seriously to the cities. We have smart cities mission, but that is for 100 smart cities. Then we have Amrit, Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation. That is another 500 cities. But we have around 7,900, something like around 8,000 cities and towns. So you can imagine this almost 7,000 cities, 7,000 urban centers, they don't have any funding. So what we are seeing, whatever the funding is there from the government side, it is just for less than 1,000 cities and towns. So rest of the towns, urban centers, they don't have funding. Then when the funding comes in a project mode. So government officials in a small town, why they are going to make so much, take the pain of making the project, and there are a lot of risk. So in many cases, what you see in terms of program and funding, it doesn't reach. It doesn't actually spend. So this is happening from the government side, and it is entirely messy. Urban development is a state subject, but all programs you find, most of the programs you find coming from the central government. And when there is some sort of failure, then of course this happens for every program. It is not for urban development, it is for rural development, for the health sector. So center-state relationship is very, very important, and how state government becomes active, how the planning board of states become active. These are very crucial things, because without planning, there cannot be good governance. This is my way of looking or understanding, that if you want to have a good governance, you must have a planning. But in this country, everything is happening in a project mode, and planning is abundant. Whatever planning we have, centralized, top down, bureaucratic, corrupt, this is why whatever is the planning, we don't have the bottom up and decentralized type of planning, which is the need of the hour. So I'm very surprised to see, and I must make a plea or argue for the 74th amendment to the Constitution. It should be implemented letter and spirit. And within this amendment, planning is, I think, very fundamental thing, and planning and governance very closely related. So I am wondering to see sometime MG Narega, how MG Narega can run without a village plan, how you can create an asset in village without having a plan, how we can have Swachh Bharat without having a plan, because Swachh Bharat is not simply constructing toilet and after some time there is no water available in the household or in the village. So it must be linked with watershed development. It must be linked with piped water supply within the village. So village planning is very, very critical. And that is the bottom of planning, right from the village to the block level to the district level and then state and the country. So this bottom up planning, decentralized planning, that is, I think, the core, and participatory planning. It is not the planning should be expert driven, but what is happening, it is a project in project mode, and experts now making the plan, and then it is not serving the interest of the people. So plan and people are separate. Planning is for capital accumulation, not for the people. So this is disconnect. So again, in exclusionary urbanization, these are the mechanism of governance and planning, which are extremely instrumental in excluding. So in the context of city, if you see, city should have been also planned and governed in that way. But this is not happening. Planning is now virtually abundant. There is nothing like culture of planning or thinking about planning, but think of project. And each project is not connected with other project. So therefore, the crucial issue, I think, that is a fundamental political and economic issue, is who owns the city? Who owns the city? And that is fundamentally, and when we look at who owns the city, now everybody is owning the city. And those who are the big players, they are owning the city. It is private players owning the city. It is state government owning the city. It is central government owning the city. And so city, it has become, from governance point of view, it has become very, very chaotic. Therefore, under 74th Amendment to the Constitution, city must be restored to the local bodies and the local governance. That is, I think. But now what is happening? After 74th Amendment, a lot of things has happened to dismantle this type of spirit that is coming from the 74th Amendment. And now you see, if you look at metro, as Dr. Sood has pointed out with a lot of examples, I think very, very good examples and very practical, and what is happening at a grassroots level. So at a governance level, you find multi-layers. We have municipal corporation, then we have development authority. So you have Municipal Corporation of Hyderabad, and then Urban Authority, Hyderabad Urban Authority, Urban Development Authority. Now, then some of the cities like Hyderabad or Ranchi or Jaipur, they have become smart city. So now we have a special purpose vehicle. So now you can see the layers: Municipal Corporation, Urban Development Authority, special purpose vehicle. Everybody is doing in their own way, owning the city, and then the people are getting disconnected. So that is what is crucial issue, that the city must be restored to the people, and people should be participating in the decision making, in making and remaking of the city. And that is what is the right to the city, that we must have right to city, right to space, and to change the space and place. And by changing space and place, we can make our life, and access to opportunities. Or so these things are, I think, critical for policy and programs. And I think this is not going to change easily, because there are a lot of political, economic issues are there. There are issues of power. So it can be changed through, not through awareness, but it requires a good social base, a good social movement, and political. So this is, I think, a very, very political issues. And but the politics, future politics, will be unfolded in the cities, and that Delhi has given for last 10 years or so, that the new party has emerged, whether successful or not successful, but a type of new politics around the issues related to the access to water, access to health services, access to other amenities in the cities, and how people are getting access. So if that is happening in a good way, it can beat communal polarization. It can beat money power, a lot of money power that is coming in our elections. So in spite of the lot of pressure, a lot of force, that type of politics still wins. So I think this is largely a political issue, and governance, I think, very, very important. And looking governance from political, electoral reforms and strengthening people. The migration issue becoming important. They are marginal. They are not part of the city. They are excluded politically. A group of migrants are politically excluded. They don't have voting rights within the city. So I think they are voiceless. So this is the particular migrant who are circulating, who are temporary migrants, who are working in the construction sector or other informal sectors, not like migrants, you and me, who are also migrant, but we can vote. We are included in the urban system. We are permanent and semi-permanent migrants. So this migration is not a single form. It has multiple forms, and we must address in a disaggregated way the seasonal, temporary migrants who are economically excluded and also politically excluded. So the pandemic has brought this thing to our light, and you have seen that before Bihar election, people went to Bihar, but after 2-3 months they returned. But in the meantime, there was a Bihar election. So they cannot go again and to vote in the Bihar, because their names are there in the voter list in Bihar, not in Mumbai or in Delhi, many of them. So the political exclusion, and therefore you will be surprising that Bihar is such a politically conscious state, but voting percentage is 54%. How come Bihar? I can understand in Delhi or Mumbai, people are not voting, or there are less percentage of voting turnout, but Bihar, where 54% turnout, it is not only this election, last election also, a large part of the Bihari population are excluded, defranchised, because they live outside and their names are there, and some all those who are old migrants, only their names are politically included. So these larger issues of political exclusion also taking place in respect with our seasonal and circulatory migrants. So I think a lot of things are there to discuss, and I think Dr. Sood has rightly focused on the basic issues of this peripheral urbanization led by the metropolitan cities and what is happening actually. And this, what my argument will be, or my line of thinking will be, that this is a very political issue. The way we can articulate, and then there are economic aspects, and economists have a great role to play in understanding this type of dynamics of capital accumulation. But there should be partnership of political scientists also and civil society also to understanding what is happening, because urban is going to affect everybody. It is affecting everybody. So I will stop here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bharat. Really, there is a serious policy disconnect between the rhetoric of the urban policies and the reality. Whereas all the central government or state government urban plan and policies, they are actually advocating more and more depoliticization. But if you're looking at the urban poor people, they are actually taking the help of these political person, be their locally elected representatives, or maybe the informally they are approaching the local political powerful person to ensure their access to the basic services which are basically needed for their survival to their cities. Obviously, and they have no other option but to approach these councillors or the informal local powerful people, because state has failed to provide them with some basic services. So and also you have advocated the need for the right to the city, which is again very much a political issue. So it's now over to Dr. Sood for your response to what Professor Bhagavat has said.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Bhagat. I mean, it's quite truly an honor for me to, have your comments on this presentation. I cannot agree more. I think that, we have to reinstate politics at the center of our cities. And, this move, the neoliberal move towards depoliticization has really, served to exclude. But I did want to just sort of add, I think, sort of one point, which is that, I think a lot of what we are documenting, and especially with these specialized forms of governance, these are not really new. This is what is so remarkable. So I did show you a photograph of Bokaro, for example. There's been Jamshedpur, many of the steel towns. These private forms of government are actually quite rife, and they were really set in motion at the same time. I mean, they've had a long history, but they were given a new impetus by the 74th Constitutional Amendment itself, which has this exception of the industrial township. And this is an exception that has been invoked, for example, in Hyderabad and Telangana, and of course in Andhra Pradesh before that, to create these special areas. I do think that enclaves are very central to the imagination of this neoliberal city, and we've not paid enough attention to them. And they do serve as a kind of a opposition, a very strong fort, if you like, against this kind of occupancy politics, which is really what makes the cities livable. If you think about, and this is something I tell my students, most of our cities are like icebergs, because what you see is such a small proportion. What can be counted, what actually is part of our data, is a part of the policymakers' imagination. This formal employment, the formal settlements. About 82% of all Indian workers are informally employed. Even in cities like Delhi, over 3/4 actually live in informal settlements, right? So this is the reality of the Indian city. But policymakers see this very small segment, and I think this is a big part of the challenge of politics. How do you make this, invisible, visible. And so, Professor Bhagat, I cannot agree more. I do think that, I agree with you that politics has to come to the center of our imagination, and it cannot be a technocratic exercise by economists for sure. It has to really be the conscious work of all the participants in the city, but also to recognize the continuities. I did point out today some of the discontinuities, some of the breaks and the ruptures, but there are actually lots of continuities from what has been happening in our cities for the last pre-independence period. That's just something that I wanted to bring to your attention. And we need to understand the continuities in order to understand where things went wrong and how to put them right.
So thank you, Dr. Sudh. Now let's now request Professor Gopa Samanto. You are really fortunate to have her with us. So actually, when she informed me that she will be registering for this program, so immediately I requested Dr. Arjun, say, why not we have Professor Samanto as one of our panelists, because it's really the topic in which she's almost a specialized. She has done a lot of research. So just a very formal introduction, like Professor Gopa Samanto is from University of Burdwan, and she has been doing a lot of research on these urban related issues, especially on the smaller cities. And she did some excellent collaborative work with the CPR and the subaltern urbanization. So it's over to Professor Samanto for your comments or any questions, anything on Dr. Sudh's presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Shomodeep. Am I audible?
Yes.
Because my connection was poor. Okay, thank you. Thank you for bringing me here, because Ashima is really a good friend of mine, and it is always wonderful to listen to Ashima. Ashima has done a very well organized kind of ideas about what is happening these days around, especially around governance and looking at the migrants problem. Then my first comment would be, when we use the term that migrant, then we have to be very careful, as Professor Bhagat has already mentioned this, that when we use the term migrant, in fact, the cities, today's global cities or smart cities or whatever it is, neoliberal cities are expanding only for the migrants, but those are actually migrants coming from the upper ladder. I think, they are either middle class, upper middle class, or rich class. They are all migrants. So we have to use the term very specifically, that here for the migrant, when we talk about migrant, we target poor migrants or labor migrants. That's a very specific term. We have to be very careful, because each cities are growing only by the migrants, But we don't take into account these IT people who are moving from one city to other city, all these private university faculties, or many other new entrepreneurship and the employment sector we do not count when we think about migration. And that is my first thing to add. And what I would like to also tell you that Ashima has very nicely told us that this Periyar, there are a lot of agencies, like so many stakeholders working at the for the urban governance sector, in fact. And yes, 74th Amendment, again, it's an important issue. And as Shomodeep has already pointed out, that it is half done. It's not yet that entire devolution, financial devolution is not yet done. But Shomodeep, I have a reservation to your comment, because, even if we think that, as my own understanding of smaller cities, that it's not also possible if we leave the smaller cities to survive on their own and taking the credit from the market, they are not at all in that position to carry on. And my question is, why do we ask the cities to survive on their own? You know, these are also part of our country, and these are also important places. If we consider the cities are centers of economic growth, then why would we ask the cities to survive on their own? They have to arrange their funding from market, and they have to provide the services. This is not just done. We cannot tell them, like all other sectors we are doing, we are pushing more, that we are withdrawing public sector and we are pushing for more and more privatization in health sector, in education sector. So the same strategy I really critique for, even for the cities. Another important thing I would like to raise, that these days, Professor Bhagat has nicely presented already, that we always think about a project and program, you know, but cities, basic things, when we think about the services in a city, then we think about only a few things, like, you know, water, electricity, street lighting enough, and sanitation. That's all. In fact, otherwise, many other things. And also, till now, in India, the cities in the health sector, education sector, they have very, very negligible presence. You know, these are under the different line departments, like, you know, state government, education department. So schools are under the education department. Health sectors are also under the health department. These are not at all within the city's government. And I do not argue for city's government, for the stake of city's government in these sectors. So my point is that this project orientation, you know, cities, they need continuous funding and fund flow for certain kind of things, like providing enough water, potable water to all the citizens, and also the sanitation and solid waste management, etc., etc. Then we are not pumping money continuously into those sectors. We are developing projects like Amrut and then JNNURM, etc., etc. We have different types of ideas that, and if we see that, we will see in those projects, actually we are trying to focus more on infrastructure, because we want to project the cities as engines of growth. We are focused, as already Ashima has pointed out, that always we are targeting to make it like, you know, the center of neoliberal investment. You know, that's why we are focusing more on infrastructure, and we are neglecting the service sector. That is very, very important in the governance sector. And in case when there is a project, it is always the funds are coming, which is called the tied fund, that you cannot utilize a fund allocated for something under some project into another thing. But cities must have a choice to choose when, so they need more untied fund. For example, the central government funding is for, you know, transport, development of roads and overbridge and etc., flyovers, etc., etc. But probably that particular city needs more water infrastructure than the flyover. But you cannot switch fund from one head to the other if the funds are tied. So we have to think about cities needs funding from the government sector. Smaller cities especially, that they can never run on their own through a minimal kind of, you know, resource generation they have at their disposal from, and they are not capable of bringing those from the market as such. So the thing is, we have to consider that rather than thinking about a different project targeting different kinds, the cities are the cities should be facilitated by a continuous fund flow for certain kinds of minimal service provision. That is very, very important for each cities, even if it is a small one or big one or whatever. And then another thing is, then the question comes the planning. You know, Professor Bhagat has already raised that issue, that planning, we are not planning and we are just going whatever we are thinking that it is something like that. But I also have a different angle to bring into this, because we always planned for, but we never thought about where we are going to keep the poor people to run our cities. No, wherever there was a plan, like even if these days we think that smart cities are definitely planned cities, but where we are thinking that we are going to keep the poor migrants, at least the labor class, without whom the cities, no city in India can run on their own. We need them, but we never thought of keeping them and including them within our cities. Probably you know that just like the housing sector, we had a housing for all program. And when that very program was conceptualized, I was just thinking that how many people have the land on their own that they can build their own houses. And now you see, after failing that program, now we are thinking about, it's not the rental housing program, newly developed rental housing program. So the thing is, it's not only planning, it is about the sensitiveness of the planners and policymakers or the local government, whoever is in power, that we cannot build our cities only for industrial houses, only for market sector, only for rich and middle class. We need a huge number of poor migrants, labor class, informal sectors, without whom we cannot run our cities. So we have to be sensitive enough that we can accommodate them within our cities. Otherwise, it will always be like exclusionary. And we are seeing more and more that we are prioritizing the private corporates and other sectors and government is facilitating displacement of slums. Like, you know, when I use the term slum, then it comes to my mind that slum, we had created slum. You know, it's not that poor people have just walked into the city and they have created the slum. No, because they're forced to live in a slum because we have not left any space to accommodate them in the cities. So even if we think about planning, then planning must be sensitive enough so that we can think about the poor people to bring in. And also another point Ashima has raised, that peri-urban. You know, peri-urban is really, really very crucial areas where, you know, there is either multiple governance or no complete, you know, it is probably under the city, already city is encroaching upon that area, peri-urban area, but probably, you know, the governance is under, like, you know, it's like a panchayat, gram panchayat kind of. They are not even capable of. The same thing happens as Professor Bhagat has already raised, that the same thing happens to census towns of India as well. So in that case, peri-urban areas are also, but in most cases, these peri-urban areas comes under the development authority. And when it is again under the development authority, the full attention is going towards infrastructure. So my end point would be that we need to focus more and more on the services rather than putting more emphasis on the infrastructure. And I would try to define that way, that neoliberal infrastructure, which are friendly for upper class citizens or higher middle class citizens. So that's very, very important, because we need it at least, because water, if we think about water and sanitation sector, then probably gated community, they do not anymore depend on the municipal services. It is only poor in most cases. If we think about the smaller cities, it is only poor who are basically more dependent on the city governments for their services. So if there is a lack of interest in developing more and more public sectors, more public service sector services within the, we are becoming exclusionary absolutely in practice, which we need to rethink. So I think if we really sensitive about our urban future, especially in India, which is no more in the metropolitan cities only, because the smaller cities are big metropolitan cities have already become exclusionary because of the real estate and all these things. So even the smaller cities are taking the same path, and we are more and more pushing off the poor people from the cities. So if we policymakers, so whoever is in their capacity, if we are not sensitive enough about the demand for the poor, and we think about inclusionary cities, then really we are creating more and more trouble for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Samanto, for raising so many important points. So all of them are really, really very much pertinent for our today's discussion. And just to add to your whatever you have said, what I think is that if we look at the urban plans and policies, they have a tendency to view the informality. Because why I'm saying about this informality, because informality is the way through which the urban poor, they're negotiating with the cities. But unfortunately, if we look at the dominant urban plan and policies in India, then they have a tendency to view the informality as a problem, and they tend to criminalize it rather than considering it as a solution, which they develop, so to say, organically to address some of the challenges posed by these neoliberal policies and all these things. So what, as you rightly mentioned, that the state, they need to take cognizance of and learn from the informal practices, and they need to try to incorporate whatever informal practices they are actually practicing into the for developing policies and plans that and then only our cities can be truly inclusive in nature. And secondly, regarding the incomplete decentralization, yes, so that is another important thing, that the basic problem with this decentralization framework is that it actually adopts a one size fit for all approach. So definitely the needs and priorities, the socio-political consideration, the factors, all those are vary from city to city. So we need to take into account, for example, it would be rather erroneous for us to assume that the City Corporation of Mumbai, the functional domain of the City Corporation of Greater Mumbai would be same as the functional domain of the, say, smaller city of, say, Odisha or West Bengal. So we need to think about all these things. So thank you very much for your comments and all the points you have raised. Now it's over to Dr. Sood, if you want to respond what Professor Samanto has said.
No, I'm so glad to have this chance to speak to Professor Gopa. She's actually been one of the people who've been kind enough to look at this paper, and the process it's gone through multiple revisions. And so I'm so glad to have her comments today. And, Professor Gopa, I absolutely agree, both your point and Professor Bhagat's point about migrants and the sort of utter diversity of migration streams that we see in Indian cities. And of course, what may be called permanent migrants, those who are actually captured or have been captured by the census are a very small part of that. And you're absolutely right that there is tremendous difference between, the really highly skilled IT migrants versus, the migrants who are, low-skilled migrants, those who are going to be really find refuge in the informal sector in the cities. In addition, I think, there is, however, a point that I wanted to make, which is that the choice of the migrant to, engage in this forms of seasonal and circular migration may also in itself reflect the very inhospitable and actually hostile conditions that they face in the city. So my argument would be to say that, it's not simply about, there is definitely categories and there are differences in the motivations of migrants. But at the same time, the choice of the fact that over, these last several decades, so few of India's rural residents have chosen to move to the cities and make the cities their home, I think says something about the fundamentally hostile conditions that these cities have created, whether it is, pre-liberalization, because really the rural was, what India was, India was a country of villages, to now when there is actually hostile neoliberal structures in place, which exclude the migrant. So, just to point out that this is almost a matter of, it is really a function of urban governance more than anything else. So thank you so much again, Professor Gopa. I do hope to continue the conversation with you, with Professor Soumyadeep, with Professor Bhagat, and of course, Dr. Kumar and Dr. Mehta as well. Thank you so much.
So just I now request Dr. Kumar to chip in and have your comments.
Simi should go first. Simi.
Okay. So just we have Dr. Simi Mehta, who is the CEO of IMPRI. So it's over to you, Simi, for your comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Simi is in Ranchi.
Good evening, sir. Professor Bhagat, Dr. Ashima, and Professor Gopa, thank you so much for your wonderful insights. I have learned so much. And I would just add as as a student of political science that how do we look at the entire theme from the systems approach, that has been given by Andre Gunda Frank and also by Samir Amin and others, and how are these peri-urban areas actually being the recipients of the so-called colony, passing it on to the peri-urban and the peripheries. So thank you so much for your insights, and I really hope to look forward to such discussions with you again. And Professor Bhagat, thank you so much. It has been so insightful listening to you, and you're truly the doyen of entire migration theories. And thank you so much. I would not take much time. Over to you, Arjun.
Thank you, Simi.
Learning is a partnership.
Thank you so much, sir. This is really humbling. Thank you.
Yes, and Simi, Professor Bhagat also highlighted that because of this, migrants are also somewhat excluded in the political sphere because of voting and many things. So rightly, that political dimension is also very important.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to point this out, but we are short of time, so maybe we can talk about it sometime next year.
But very pertinent point.
This is very interesting and very important, actually.
Yes, that who owns the city and the right to city framework. Because when we were planning the event, we really thought about the topic, suburbanization, suburb project, many things. We are also looking, small cities. But ma'am also highlighted something, exclusionary peri-urbanization. And there I really wanted, as also Ashima ma'am, 1-2 minutes to also conclude on this issue. That and there are also issues of slums and rentals, so many things our Professor Gopa Samantha also highlighted. That then most of our peri-urbanization are, I would say, exclusionary, but the highlight is also that it is ignored. No one is there to take care. Also, Professor Sood also highlighted that how the structures are also evolving, and how the political process or the decision-making process, as Professor Bhagat is also highlighting, especially for services, not for high-class infrastructure, also as Professor Samantha is highlighting. So, but this year has been really of the Indian story was the this precarious affairs and migrant exodus. So why not? Let's to conclude. We can go 2 minutes to Ashima ma'am, and then Professor Bhagat sir, also Professor Gopa, Samadip sir. Would you also like to add? Concluding 2 minutes. Yes.
Yes, I think let's start with Professor Bhagat and Professor Samantha, and then we will go to Dr. Sood, because she is our speaker today. So it's over to Professor Bhagat. Your quick points.
Yes, so I was I will continue what I said a little bit more. So what is city? If you see what is city, city has become a political entity. Actually, city is a unbounded category. There is no boundary. But who fixes the boundary? It is the government who is fixing the boundary. So city begins and city ends by the government. Government is extending the boundary and it becomes the municipal. This is a lot of politics going on. The politics of making boundary, because boundary makes the sense in the way that the laws will be implemented. So municipal laws and taxation and etc. So all these things are there, the political issues, and so it is connected very much. And then Dr. Somdeep Chattopadhyay, what you raised about decentralization, very important thing. So we have to see decentralization as a subject, urban development subject belonging to state. It is not the central government. 74th Amendment has been done by the central government or by parliament, but actually it will be implemented by state government. Who is hampering? Who is blocking 74th Amendment? It is the state government blocking, by and large. So state government of Maharashtra or government of Telangana doesn't want to leave Hyderabad or Bombay. Bombay having, if you see the revenue base, revenue of Bombay is larger than 17 states of India. if you see 17, Goa, Nagaland, Manipur, all these states, Himachal Pradesh, Jammu Kashmir, you can see huge. Without Bombay, you cannot imagine Maharashtra. So state government doesn't want to leave. So 74th Amendment actually is the responsibility of the state government to empower these things, and decentralization will not be in one type. Decentralization in Odisha will be entirely different, and within the imagination of government of Odisha, or in respect with the people of Odisha, so will be. So I think there are a lot of issues to highlight, but today's discussion was very enriching, very a lot of learning. I also learned from Dr. Sood's presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bhagat. Yes, thank you, Professor Bhagat. Now it's over to Professor Samanto. If you have any quick points.
Yeah, thank you once again. In fact, you know that urbanization recently, Neil Brenner written another new book, which I was attending other day, the book discussion. I think Oshima was also there. I can't remember exactly. We always link urbanization with the territorial. Probably we have to think that urbanization is a process, and we cannot always link urbanization process with cities' territorial limits only. Because even if we think about, as Oshima has, and census towns, Professor Bhagat has also told in many places, and I have also a little worked on those. So even the process of urbanization itself, we cannot limit within cities. So we have to think that everywhere, and these days, early industrial houses used to be located within the urban areas, and these days they want to escape even the development authority areas, so that they can escape from the stipulated norms of the development authority areas. So they always look for even the new industrial locations. If you look into the industrial houses, they are also part of the process of urbanization. So we cannot only understand the process of urbanization with the help of city limits only. Cities are a distinctive forms of urban processes, and definitely they have a territorial limits, but as long as we do not accept the process of urbanization, which is not only limited within the territorial limits of a city, then we point it out. So, and also another point I would like to add, that politics is everywhere. We cannot just make urbanization and urban decisions out of politics. It's not possible. But what we feel that in case of state, as Professor Bhagat has rightly pointed out, that state governments are controlling the cities. And yes, their main funds, the main funding comes from especially the smaller cities, the main funding comes from the state bodies itself, Urban Development Ministry, or like in West Bengal, it is both urban development and municipal affairs. So in that case, what we see that even if we think about decentralization, then at every scale, a centralization is occurring. How? Because central government is trying to control more and more state governments, and state governments are trying to control the local governments. So this process of centralization, I just would like to give one example from West Bengal case, as if that when the government, which political party is in the government of that particular city. So even the funding, the level of funding, and proportion of funding depends on whether the same city government is under the same party which is controlling the state government. If there is a different government, different political party operating at that city level, then there is a problem of funding. Okay, the citizens of this city, they have not voted for us. Why would you give them the funding? It's a plain and simple declaration. Sometimes is made by different politicians. That is one thing I would like to address, and also another, centralization and devolution of power, a little power. After a very long time, only in 2006, we had a different regime of left front government for so long time. So we did not think about the pay and use services for the cities. But finally, in 2006, the earlier government of left front government decided, okay, we can raise a little revenue from the cities through the water tax. In the next state level election, the main agenda of that election was, okay, if we come to the power, we will try to stop taking the water taxes. And after that, when there was no government order, it was just a verbal order from the government and to all the city governments, that state government to the city governments, that you don't take water taxes anymore. And you know how much these cities started to lose their revenue? Somewhere it is 40 lakh per. Even if Shomadip, I'm talking about Bolpur, I interviewed that vice chairman, and he told me that it was 42 lakh, which we used to raise as revenue per month from water sector, and they have lost. So it's a very complicated process, and I really don't have a one-way solution of it. But we have to think about rigorously. We have to work on at least the people who are thinking about cities. And even if we know that nobody is going to listen to us, we have to say it again and again. That's all.
So thank you. So that's why we are organizing the City Conversation series, so that we can reach the policymakers if in some way. So it's over to Dr. Shruth for your concluding, maybe a minute, if you could, please.
Yes, absolutely. I did want to, bring to everybody's attention, this sort of very unusual saying by Professor Gavin Sifkin, who many of you may know. He's, of course, an urbanist. And, he makes the point in his recent book, that Indian cities are over-planned and under-governed. And it's a very provocative point, and sort of has also been very much a starting point for my own analysis. Because, when I started looking at, the kinds of informality that we see in our cities, it was absolutely, as Professor Bhagat pointed out, and Professor Samanta is pointing out, it is part of the plan, right? The unplanned is part of the plan. And if you choose to exclude, large segments of the population from the plan, then, you should expect that there would be forms of informality that would emerge. But also equally that these populations are governed very, very differently. That's the one thing I want to see. And finally, I did want to say it's been, such a privilege and such an honor to interact with Professor Bhagat and Professor Samanta, because both of their work has been such an inspiration for my own. So thank you so much, Professor Soumyadeep, Dr. Kumar, and the rest of the IMPRI team for making this conversation possible. Thank you again.
Thank you. On behalf of Team IMPRI, once again, I thank you all for participating in this City Conversation series, and we look forward to your participation in the future events of City Conversation as well. So a very good evening and good night. So from from our end. So thank you. Have a nice evening.